Back David Gunkel for his second lecture in our three-lecture series. Let me introduce David Gunkel real quick to you. He is an award-winning philosopher who specializes in the philosophy of technology, and he has a focus on moral and legal challenges in artificial intelligence and robots. Professor Gunkel is internationally recognized for his innovative work on the moral and legal status of artificial intelligence and robot rights. And he currently holds two positions. One, presidential research and scholarship and art history professor in the Department of Communications in Northern Illinois University. And he's also associate professor of applied ethics at Warszawski, I hope I say that right, University in Warsaw in Poland. He has written many influential books on these topics. The most well-known, perhaps, that many of you will know is The Machine Question, Critical Perspectives on AI, Robots, and Ethics. And today he will talk to us about the question of whether writing has a future. Join me in welcoming again David Gunkel.
Thank you all for coming this afternoon and for your interest in this topic. The title, I have to say, is not my own. It's an act of plagiarism. I actually stole the title, and I stole the title from this guy, Philosohy, who is a Brazilian Czech media theorist. And in the 1980s, 1987, I believe, in fact, he used this title in a book that he wrote about the pressures that he thought writing was feeling as a result of innovations in digital technology, specifically the internet, the web, and other forms of multimedia and hypertext. And so at the time he's writing, he explains the concern this way. Writing, in the sense of placing letters and other marks one after the other, appears to have little or no future. Information is now more effectively transmitted by codes other than those of written signs. What was once written can now be conveyed more effectively on tapes, records, films, videotapes, video discs, or computer discs. And I'm using his title, or I'm repurposing his title, because it seems now, 35 plus years later, we are again looking at the question of whether or not writing has a future. But this time, due to the impressive developments in large language models and other forms of generative artificial intelligence that are producing and creating content in ways that we are able to control with a prompt, but also questioning whether or not writing, again, has a future. So I'm using Flusser's question and applying it to the technology that, for us, looks to be disruptive and changing the way in which we communicate. And in the face of these 21st century innovations, we find ourselves once again asking seemingly apocalyptic questions about writing and its future. Thus, it seems prudent, I think, to reissue Flusser's question and ask, does writing have a future? And we can, I think, follow Flusser's example and begin with a rather direct statement in response to this question. What large language models signify is not the end of writing, but the terminal limits of a particular conceptualization of writing that has been called logocentrism. In other words, writing indeed has a future, but only if we reconceptualize how we think about writing and write about thinking. So here's the plan of attack that I want to take on today. I want to begin by briefly characterizing the three defining characteristics of this logocentric metaphysics that I want to talk about. Then in part two, I want to investigate how large language models disrupt logocentrism by releasing a deconstruction of its organizing principles. And then finally, in part three, I want to formulate the terms and the conditions of an alternative way to think and write about LLMs and generative AI that escape the conceptual grasp of this traditional way of thinking and its control over our way of grasping some of these questions. So let's start with this idea of logocentric metaphysics. One of the main complaints or the criticisms directed against large language models, like OpenAI's ChatGPT, Google's Gemini, DeepSeek, or Claude, is that these technologies generate seemingly intelligible statements, but they do not know and they cannot understand what it is they are saying. Versions of this have proliferated in both the academic and the popular media. Consider the following explanation offered by Ian Bogost in an op-ed that he wrote for the magazine The Atlantic. ChatGPT lacks the ability to truly understand the complexity of human language and conversation. It is simply trained to generate words based on a given input, but it does not have the ability to truly comprehend the meaning behind those words. Or a similar statement from linguist Emily Bender in a profile that was published about her in New York Magazine. The models are built on statistics. They're great at mimicry and bad at facts. Why? Large language models have no access to real-world embodied reference. Now, if the terms of these critical appraisals sound familiar, they should, because it's just good old-fashioned logocentric metaphysics. But what do I mean by that? Logocentrism is a term that was originally coined by the German philosopher Ludwig Klages in the early 1900s. It refers to the tradition in Western science and philosophy that regards words and language as fundamental expressions of an external reality. Now, we don't have time for a deep dive into the entire history and consequences of this influential way of thinking. Instead, I want to note 3 characteristics that are already at play and operationalized in the current conversations and debates that we are having right now about large language models and other forms of generative artificial intelligence. So first, there is a hierarchy in this way of thinking between words and things. And that hierarchy is originally arranged for us and organized by Aristotle in something he called De Interpretatione. And this is the way Aristotle explains it. Spoken words are the symbols of mental experience, and written words are the symbols of spoken words. Just as all men have not the same writing, so all men have not the same speech sounds. But the mental experiences of which these directly symbolize are the same for all, as also are those things of which our experiences are the images. Now, that's a mouthful, so let's just break it down a little bit and figure out what Aristotle is saying. In effect, he is saying that there's things, and by way of our senses, these produce images in our mind. These are then represented by spoken words, which are then subsequently represented by written signs. And if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, well, yeah, that's just obvious, like why even mention that? That thought itself is the evidence of the extent to which this way of thinking has been the basic operating system of the usual way of understanding language. Second, writing is a technology. Unlike speech, which is considered to be a natural and inherent capability of the human species and a direct symbol of thought, writing is artificial, external, and technical. As Walter Ong explained in the book Orality and Literacy, writing, and especially alphabetic writing, is a technology, calling for the use of tools and other equipment. By contrast with natural oral speech, writing is completely artificial. And it's for this reason that writing is already situated as a form of artificial intelligence all the way back in Plato's time. Because as Plato has Socrates say in the Phaedrus, and so it is with written words, you might think they spoke as if they had intelligence. But if you question them, wishing to know their sayings, they always say one and the same thing. So the idea here being that writing is already a form of artifice, artificial intelligence, because it simulates intelligence even though it's not intelligent, right? Third and finally, writing is useful only to the extent that it is an instrument of expression. As a secondary and derived representation of speech, what matters most with writing is what its progenitor intended to say. And Jacques Derrida explains it this way, and I have to see it myself. If for Aristotle, spoken words are the symbols of mental experience, and written words are the symbols of spoken words, it is because the voice, the producer of the first symbols, has a relationship of essential and immediate proximity with the mind. Producer of the first signifier, it is not just a simple signifier among others. It signifies mental experiences which themselves reflect or mirror things by natural resemblance. And if after reading that you're saying to yourself, what is it Derrida is actually trying to say here? That question, a mode of inquiry that seeks to discover what an author is saying in and by the writing, that is exactly what logocentrism is all about. That writing is the representation of speech, and speech is the representation of thought. All right, so that's a very quick overview of what this logocentric idea is. Now, the fundamental challenge or the opportunity with large language models and other forms of generative AI, like OpenAI's ChatGPT, Google's Gemini, and DeepSeek, is that these algorithms write without speaking, without having access to the living logos, or without an embodied or living voice that animates what it is they produce. In response to this seemingly monstrous problem, contemporary critiques, like those offered by Logos, Bender, and many others, proceed from and reassert the truth of logocentric metaphysics with little or no critical hesitation. These algorithms, they argue, might be able to arrange words in seemingly intelligible orders, but they do not know what it is they are saying. They do not have access to the real world. They do not know what the signs they are using mean. Consequently, the problem is not that this logocentric way has somehow failed to work in the face of these new technologies of writing. It's quite the opposite. The problem is that logocentrism works all too well, exerting its influence over our thinking about writing and our writing about thinking in ways that go by largely without notice. What makes large language models so important and interesting is that they disrupt this way of thinking. And they do it in at least three ways. And what I want to do is just briefly characterize the three modes of disruption that large language models introduce into this standard way of thinking. So first, it undermines the very notion of authority, authorship, and accountability. When confronted with any written document, one of the first questions we ask is who wrote it, and can therefore be held responsible for what has been written. Now, responses to this question have typically been resolved by identifying the author, who it is commonly assumed speaks to us through the instrumentality of the written text. But, as Michel Foucault explains in a title that is, What is it, an Author, from 1969, this concept is not some natural occurring phenomenon. It was a literary and legal affordance, deliberately fabricated at a particular time and place in an effort to determine and decide who is speaking. The author, as Roland Barthes explained, is a modern figure, a product of our society insofar as emerging from the Middle Ages with English empiricism, French rationalism, and the personal faith of the Reformation. It discovered the prestige of the individual, of, as it is more nobly put, the human person. Prior to this modern and very distinctly European innovation, Barthes contends, there were perhaps writers or generators of text, but no authors as we currently understand and use the term. And like many theorists of his time, such as Marcel Mauss, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Barthes employs the critical foil provided by 20th century anthropological discoveries, and he explains it this way. In ethnographic societies, the responsibility for a narrative is never assumed by a person, but by a mediator, a shaman, or a relator, whose performance, the mastery of the narrative code, may possibly be admired, but never his genius. So Barthes' point is that outside the experiences and the traditions of European modernism, narratives have been successfully developed, performed, and accumulated without necessarily needing what is called the author. So Barthes' point is very simple, that the author is not some natural kind that has always been with us. It has a historical period. It is invented at a certain moment in history to help us understand what the new technology of especially the printing press was all about. So he's sort of tracking the way in which it's developed in the modern period. But if the author, as the principal figure of accountability in literature, comes into existence in a particular place and at a specific moment in time, there is also a point at which he argues it may cease to fulfill this role. And it is this disappearance and withdrawal of what had been the principal figure of literary authority that is announced and marked by his seemingly apocalyptic title, The Death of the Author. What this phrase indicates is not the end of life of any particular individual or the end of human writing, but the terminal limits of the figure of the author as the authorizing agent and guarantee of what is said in and by writing. Though Barthes and Foucault obviously did not and could not address themselves to large language models, their work on the author function anticipates our current situation with algorithmically generated content. What we have now with large language models are writings without the underlying intentions of some embodied living voice to animate and answer for what comes to be written. Consequently, such writings are quite literally unauthorized. But instead of this being a criticism concerning what these AI-generated texts lack, it shows us the extent to which the authority for writing, any form of writing, whether it's human or machine, has always and already been a socially constructed artifice. As a result, we can say that the writings produced by large language models are quite literally unauthorized, or a kind of authority without an author that, as Bernard Stiegler has written, adheres in all writing as techniques. Second, this affects the means of meaning. Once the written text is cut loose from the controlling interests and intentions of an author, the question concerning significance gets turned around. Specifically, the meaning of a piece of writing is not something that can be guaranteed in advance by the authentic character or the ethos of the one who is assumed to be speaking through the medium of the text. Instead, meaning transpires in and from the process of reading and our interpretation. And if it is the case that this significance had always been customarily attributed to an author, that attribution is and has actually always and only been projected backwards from a reader onto a supposed and oftentimes absent author. Meaning-making, in other words, is an effect of reading that is then retroactively presupposited, as Zizek says, to become its own presumed cause. This flipping of the script on modern literary theory changes the location of meaning-making from the original intentions of an author or a writer who has something to say to the interpretive activity of the reader who makes meaning in or generates it out of the materiality of the written content. As Barthes explains, text is made of multiple writings, drawn from many cultures and entering into mutual relations of dialogue, parody, contestation. But there is one place where this multiplicity is focused, and that place is the reader. A text's unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination. Thus, the meaning of a text, whether it is written by a human author, generated by a large language model, or assembled from the productive interaction and collaboration between the human and the machine, is situated in the interpreting and meaning-making that is produced in and by the activity of reading. So logocentric theory has actually had things backwards and upside down for 2,000 years. This also explains how AI-generated content comes to have meaning. The critics are correct when they point out, for instance, that ChatGPT lacks the ability to truly understand the complexity of human language and conversation. But it would be impetuous for us to conclude from this fact that the AI-generated text is nonsense, meaningless, or bullshit. These writings are meaningful, and what they mean is something that happens in the process of our reading, our interpretation, and the evaluation we bring to the generated content. And this fact is not something that is specific to large language models and the content they generate, but it is, as Barthes argued, already a defining characteristic of all kinds of writing, whether machine-generated or human-made. Third and finally, the issue is not really where meaning is located and produced. What is really at issue here is the concept of meaning itself. Beginning with Aristotle and persisting in the current critique of AI technology, language is assumed to consist of signs that refer and defer to signifieds or things. When we write the words large language model, for instance, it is assumed that those linguistic tokens stand for and refer to some real thing out there in the world, like the ChatGPT application that was developed by OpenAI. The signification sign, as Derrida explains, has always been understood and determined in its meaning as sign of, a signifier referring to a signifier different from its signified. So words are assumed to have meaning because someone, like an author, who we assume is an embodied human person with access to the real world outside language, uses words to refer to and say something about things. And the big problem with large language models and generative AI is that they simply lack this ability. They manipulate words and linguistic tokens without knowing or caring what the signs they manipulate refer to. But the seemingly common sense view of how language works is not necessarily the natural order of things. It has been directly challenged by 20th century innovations in structural linguistics, which sees language and meaning-making as a matter of difference situated within the materiality of language itself. And Saussure explains it this way. In language, there are only differences. Even more important, a difference generally implies positive terms between which the difference is set up. But in language, there are only differences without positive terms. Signs, therefore, do not, at least not principally and or exclusively, come to have meaning by direct reference to things that exist outside the system of signs. Signs refer to and defer to other signs in a system of signs. Now, Saussure doesn't use this example, but it's the dictionary that I think provides what is one of the best illustrations of this basic semiotic principle. Words come to have meaning through their differential relationships to other words. In other words, when you look up a word in a dictionary, like the word tree, you don't get a tree. You get other words that describe what a tree is. And if you don't know what some of those words are, you look up those words and you get more words. So when you pursue the meaning of a word in a dictionary, you remain caught within the system of linguistic signifiers. And we never get outside language to the referent, or what is typically called the transcendental signified. This is the meaning, or at least one of the meanings, of that famous or notorious statement that is so often associated with Derrida. There is nothing outside the text. And this is especially true for large language models. There is quite literally nothing outside the texts on which they have been trained and that they in turn generate from the input of a user prompt. They are completely enwrapped in language and never get outside language. We could therefore say, by way of remixing Wittgenstein, that for these generative AI systems, the limits of their language model mean the limits of their world. Consequently, what has been offered as a criticism of large language model technology, namely that these algorithms only circulate different signs without access to the real world embodied reference, might not be the indictment critics think it is. Large language models are structuralist machines that deconstruct the defining conceptual oppositions of classical semiotics. All right, so what does this all mean? Large language models are a significant challenge because what we have now with these technologies are things that write without speaking, a proliferation of texts that do not have nor are beholden to the authoritative voice of an author, and statements the truth of which cannot be anchored in or assured by a prior intention to say something. From one perspective, a perspective that remains bound to the epoch of logocentrism, this can only be seen as a threat and a crisis. What is on the line and in the crosshairs is our very way of understanding language and the meaning of literature. The future of writing and human communication does, in fact, seem to be in jeopardy. but from another perspective, one that follows the deconstruction of this tradition that had been developed and documented in 20th century literary theory and continental philosophy. This is an opportunity to think beyond and in excess of the limitations of Western metaphysics and its hegemony. Understood in this way, large language models and generative AI do not threaten writing, the figure of the author, or the concept of truth. They only threaten a particular and limited conceptualization, one that is itself not some naturally occurring phenomenon, but the product of a particular culture and philosophical tradition. Consequently, instead of being misunderstood as signs of the apocalypse or the end of writing, large language models and generative AI reveal the limit of logocentric privilege, participate in a deconstruction of its organizing principles, and open the opportunity to think and write differently. In the end, the future of writing depends on how we understand and theorize what is meant by the word writing. If we understand it and take it literally, that is, as the process of arranging words or linguistic tokens in linear sequence on some tangible medium, then writing will indeed continue well into the future. But who or what does that writing, and how that affects the meaning of any particular written content, is a question that is and has actually always been in flux and dynamic. Large language models simply render all of this legible. So, I'll just point out a few things here before we do Q&A. This is the last chapter in the Communicative AI book, which I mentioned yesterday, now is available in Chinese translation. Came out a few weeks ago. There's also a short version on the Noema magazine website. You know, if you want something shorter to read, that's available. But if you want to know more, it's in the book. But more importantly, in my mind, this sort of stuff is only good as a dialogue. And if that dialogue happens now, with the Q&A that we have time for today, that's great. But if your experience is like my experience, the really good question is going to occur to you, I don't know, a week from now, maybe a month from now. If that happens, my contact information is there. I invite you to reach out, because in the dialogue that this is hopefully generating, if we don't answer your question today, I'm very happy to answer it sometime in the future. So that is all I have by way of prepared remarks.
Just Q&A.
Q&A right away?
Yes.
Okay, great. I think we have about an hour for Q&A. I'll field questions.
I talked faster than I thought I would.
That's right.
Yeah.
Thanks for this. I think you do provide a very good framework of how to position our thinking on future writing versus how LLMs are changing the landscapes of writing as a whole. My field of research focuses on intellectual history, particularly the Chinese, early Chinese intellectual history.
Okay.
So there was an interesting comparison that before the Excel age, if you know what I mean, that particular epochal time range, most of the classical texts are created without an identified authorship.
Right.
It's what we call a collective authorship. And then, during the Excel age, or what we call 100 schools, because there were like Confucius, Taoism, that all created their own school of thoughts during the preaching era. So in that preaching era, or the Excel age, there is gradually, through the development of like a particular genre called signified by the MLS, it's a dialogue, and it has identified who's speaking or presenting his point of view.
Right.
That is, the coincides with like the Greek philosophy and everything. If we look at that, that's perhaps when authorship started to have its rudimentary state. And then, of course, there's like modern age, there's the subjectivity coming up, self-consciousness and all that talk. So I feel like when we're talking about writing or authorship, there is one differentiation that perhaps needs to be clarified is that there are, well, just put it bluntly, that there might be two different types of writing. That one is more subjective or creative, the other is more collective or normative, or
Right.
less so subjective. My intuition on that is that the AI is extremely helpful in providing assistance on the latter, which are the less creative or subjective kind of writing, like academic writing or writing legal documents or proposals and things like that. But when it comes to more creative and subjective writing, the story is different, because if we move the discussion into like more phenomenology or consciousness, subjectivity, stuff like that, then it's hard to make a case for the LLMs to really be able to do subjective or creative writing, since it lacks the physical presence, the experiences and things. And I was thinking when you were throughout your speech, it reminded me of Merleau-Ponty's silent cogito. Like the body is, the more primordial aspect of of beings before it can speak.
Right.
And then the whole thing about speech versus text, and well, besides the logocentric part of ontological, theological aspect of it, there is also an embodied aspect in it, like a physical, the sonorous side of the speech, your physical presence, and your body language, not just like words, and the audience's interactions, and all that, and intersubjectivity present during the speech, and the interaction between the speaker and the audience, like what we are having now in your lecture. I would rather prefer to listening to your lecture than reading your book. That's just my like there's just too much to read as I'm doing my research, and all I do every day is sit there and reading. So I prefer a more interactive and this kind of more physical experience, and that is exactly what AI cannot provide. So I felt like when talking about the future of writing, well, obviously LM can do a lot, and it's changing the way of writing completely. But on the other hand, perhaps like another dimension of it, the subjectivity side, the embodiment, the lived experience, all those, it can also bring reflections on writers in the future. I feel like for currently the trend is there is more preference to audiobook versus the text. There is more preference to watching a video, vlogs over just reading text vlogs as an example. So, and then although there is AI generated contents on that as well, but it lacks the human touch, the like real experience. Like from a reader to audience perspective, people are more drawn into an actual person performing or reading a text over an AI cold mechanic reading of a text.
So there's a lot there. There's so many things I want to say. It's really good. The first thing, the arrival of the author on the stage of history is told differently in different cultures. The way in which this notion of the single voice who embodies the writing is told one way in the sort of European trajectory, another way in the Middle East, another way in indigenous cultures. There are different stories about how the author evolves. Barthes and Foucault, being French people, they were very much interested in how the author arises in European modernism. And Foucault, in his essay, What is an Author?, says that you don't get authors until the invention of the printing press. And the reason why is that when you had printed material, it wasn't in handwriting anymore. It was in, movable type, and you couldn't tell who would be responsible for that piece of text that was written. And the French authorities, and especially the Catholic Church, wanted to know who they could punish. Because if somebody published heresy, like Galileo, and Copernicus, you wanted to know who you could, give to the Inquisition and be tortured to, figure out why they said the heresy. And so Foucault's argument is that the notion of the author is really about penal appropriation. It's about punishment. Because Foucault isn't a punishment, it's his big thing. But that's not the same story everywhere in the world. Elsewhere in the world, you get authors out of oral traditions, where you have a very long period of time where you have works of what we call literature, but we don't know who the author is. We have this in the Greek tradition. We use this name Homer to talk about the Odyssey and the Iliad. There was no Homer. Homer was a group of bards, a group of poets, who recited this oral tradition called the Odyssey. And at some point later on, in modernity in fact, somebody invented the name Homer and said that must be the author of this thing. And so what Barth is trying to do is to just call our attention to the fact that authorship is not natural. It's not some sort of phenomenon that has always been here. It comes into being to answer questions about an anxiety we have in the face of writing. And don't kid yourself, philosophy has a huge problem with writing. Philosophers don't like writing. And the proof? Plato's Phaedrus. Already in the Phaedrus, Socrates says to Phaedrus, there's this new technology that came to Athens from Egypt, it's called writing, and it is bad. And why is it bad? Because it's not embodied voice speaking the truth. It is words on a page that can be used and misused by anyone to say anything they want, and is outside the authority of its progenitor. So like you were saying, the Socratic dialogues are about interaction and about dialogue. Two voices. And writing compresses all that into frozen written signs on a page. And one of Derrida's big beefs with the tradition of Western philosophy is that it is allergic to writing. And as a result, we do weird things. So notice, Plato writes a dialogue against writing. That's a practical contradiction. Because if writing is that bad, why would you bother writing it down? And then the other thing with this embodiment business, there is this idea of the voice being in the body, but also in the phenomenological tradition and with Husserl and even with Merleau-Ponty and others, the voice is attached to the spirit. It's part of the Geist. It's part of the disembodied part of the mind in the sort of Cartesian tradition. And the materiality of the body is connected to writing. This material thing that we want to get rid of. And in Cartesian dualism, mind is privileged over body. It takes control over anything that is material, and therefore is to be trusted more than this physical stuff. So there's a lot of threads that come into this business about writing that is really about the way in which philosophy has wrestled with and tried to deal with the fact that it can only speak its truth in and by using the thing it hates, which is the written word. Yeah?
Yeah. So it's related to the question, but what I'm thinking here is maybe what you have been shown is not that there will be a death of authorship, but it's more like there will be like a shift of the conception of an author, and from many of the examples you talked about, I think there's already this kind of shift, right? Because at first people think that the author have to like handwrite.
Yeah.
And then with the printing industry and the printed things that they didn't really write it by hand, but we still think that the person is the author, right? And also now nobody writes with hand; we just type on the computer, but we still think that they are the authors. And also in the academic publishing, business, for the author of the paper, they might not even write a single word in the paper, maybe just one of the authors do the writing, but other people will still be considered as the author of the paper.
Right.
So it seems that we have this shift of what it means to be an author, and maybe with LLMs, then we will just think that maybe the prompter will be the author, or maybe the publisher of the generated paper will be the author of this writing.
Right.
So maybe so instead of saying that the author is dead or there wouldn't be any authorship anymore, but perhaps we'll just maybe broaden the conception of author.
Yeah. No, there was a lot of work on trying to think about how this concept is elastic. It changes to encompass and incorporate new things as they come along. One really good example is the notion of corporate authorship. So when you go to see a film or you watch a TV show, there is a writer of the program, there's a director, but who is the author of a film? In French film theory, we have what's called auteur theory, which said that the director must be the author because we needed somebody to identify as the sole individual who created the film. But the fact is, film is a collective endeavor. And some films are really a synergy between different interacting components in a kind of many hands situation that Nissenbaum talks about, where you have no single author, but you have many contributors to the final result. And this is this notion of the corporate author, the incorporation of numerous individuals, numerous elements coming together, some human, some maybe not human, as we look at the way in which machines play a role here. I think another way to get a handle on this is to look at what has happened. I think music in many cases leads in a lot of this area. So if we think 50 years ago, when kids in the Bronx started creating this new thing called hip hop, it created a different way of thinking about the artist and the author. So when hip hop was new and kids were using turntables to sample and mix vinyl records and create this new art form that we now recognize as hip hop, people would say, that's not really music because they're not playing instruments. They can't be musicians, they can't be singers, they're none of those things. They don't sing, they don't play instruments, all they do is spin records. Henry Rollins of Black Flag, the lead singer for that band, used to call the DJ the record player, right? Which was a way of degrading what the DJ was doing. But we discovered in that 50-year period of time that mixing and sampling and doing what we have with remix and hip hop is actually a new form of authorship. It's a form of authorship that calls upon the things around you and repurposes them in a remix that creates something brand new. And that changed our notion of what a musician is. It changed our notion of what an artist is in music. The same thing is going to happen with large language models and the kinds of textual production and other multimedia productions that we make. The author is not going to just disappear. It's going to be moved around. And it has to be moved around because we got to figure out all kinds of things like intellectual property, copyright, responsibility, other kinds of legal, moral things that go with authorship. It's not just about who the creative genius is, which is a very sort of romantic figure. But I think we're struggling right now to figure out what this new configuration is going to look like. And the debates we have about large language models, you can see pull in two very different directions. You have one group of people going backwards and taking a very conservative way of saying, there's no single human author, therefore you can't trust it. And there's other people saying, large language models are like remix. It's like oral culture because the training data is all of us. And when you prompt the model, it calls upon everything we've ever said and remixes it into a new piece of text. And that's, I think, right now where the debate is. Yeah?
I want to add also to this author question. The more you say, the more I sort of wonder whether it's really true that these notions of authorship sort of shift over the years. I mean, authorship, the way you've been describing it, is a little bit like somebody is, the core of the term is that somebody takes responsibility for something they say or write, and probably they have added some value to that thing.
We hope.
And so, you know, if you go back in time, you find examples where there's groups and people didn't really care. Groups wrote some stuff and
Right.
they didn't really care who did it. But you also find, like, when you read like Plato's dialogues, you read, you know, they're really always keen on saying like he gave that speech.
Yeah.
And then they're trying to report it as faithfully as possible. At least that's how it's told to us in those dialogues. And similarly now, you know, you have you're saying that we have collaborative work and we have single authored work. And you know, I'm just thinking the sort of the cultural technique of ascribing responsibility to individuals or groups for what they have, you know, put out. And that seems to be almost like a timeless thing.
You know, and responsibility, I think, is a really good question. Because authorship is a lot about responsibility. But look at the word responsibility. As Ricoeur points out, it is response-able. Who is assigned the ability to respond for something that is created? So in corporate authorship, the auteur theory said we've got to have somebody able to respond for the film that was made. Therefore, we'll say it's the director. It's a guess, it's a fabrication, but it fills a gap. It fills a hole. Someone can be held responsible. It becomes even more important in law when you look at copyright. Because when you create new content, somebody has to hold the copyright. And legally, someone has to be responsible for that copyright. Oftentimes, it's not the person who created the content. If you look at a lot of things that we consume, the author, the individual creator who made that thing, they are doing what's called a work for hire. They are hired by a film studio, they are hired by a record company, they are hired by a publisher. The publisher pays them for the work, and the copyright goes to Warner Brothers, or the copyright goes to McGraw-Hill. And they are the ones that hold the intellectual property. Right now, we are in a moment where this question is irresolvable with large language model created content. Because when the model creates something, we don't know who is responsible for the final product. But the law wants us to be able to assign it to somebody. So currently, at this point in time, the US Copyright Office has been asked to assign copyright and intellectual property rights to an AI. There's a scientist named Stephen Thaler who's been going around to different jurisdictions in the world and trying to register copyright and patent in the name of an AI. And the US Copyright Office said, no, the AI cannot hold copyright because the definition of author in the copyright statute is natural person, therefore it has to be this. Only this can be a natural person. And as a result, the AI can't be the author. So this sounds like a win for Team Human, right? AI can't be an author, yay us. The problem is that the prompter also can't be the author because they haven't contributed enough to make the output. As a result, we have now what are being called orphaned artworks. Artworks that are available without anybody being responsible for them. They're cut off from any paternity or any provenance whatsoever. So what does that mean in practical terms? It means that the next time you are, I don't know, in the shopping mall or in the elevator or in some restaurant, the music you might hear is going to be AI-generated music. Why? Because that business doesn't have to pay to use that music. Nobody owns it. So instead of just stopping AI stuff from flooding the market, it is actually contributing to AI slop flooding our market in both music, video, and in text. So we've got to figure this out. If you really want to get rich and famous right now, go to law school. Because right now, what is happening is everybody is suing everybody else, trying to figure out how we're going to work out this copyright thing for AI. And when people start suing each other, the only individual who makes any money in the process, the lawyers. So there's good opportunity.
Yes, the student in front.
My thought's a little bit chaotic, but I'm just saying it out. Like I'm thinking about like the things about authority. Like in the past, I think the skill of writing itself is a feature that fills out most of the people, but only a few elites possessed by the skills of writing.
Yeah.
So that their composition is highly authorized, and like the skill of writing itself signals a kind of authority. So that's why like the political discussions in the past are very like serious because everybody is able to write and everybody able to read are like all those advocated. But as the book like entertaining ourselves that say like the mediums are now like dispersing this authority all over the normal people so that everybody can create videos and everything else. But now I think up to now the like academia and the politicians still remain like retain some sort of authority by like possessing the highly sophisticated and undecipherable like coded language,
Right.
which normal people feel that they can't understand. So like when I read a text that's so complicated, I feel that it's gonna be written by an expert and he has some sort of authority. It will feel like that. But but AI is like further like giving these skills to normal people. Like we're using AI, every normal people with a very simple or even polarized opinion can compose very sophisticated text that looks like those written by an expert, but they're like highly provocative or sometimes immature in nature. So that's why I feel like AI is again putting this sort of authority into a crisis, and that's why I feel academia is so frightened and scared of the like widespread use of AI by normal people. And I feel like the authority needs to be allocated to. It always need to be allocated to some few group of elites, but in a new form, I guess, right now.
Right.
And I think AI is like pushing this entertainment to death, this trend to a further degree, like following the previous trend of a media, just a magnifier of it, I feel like.
No, it's a really good point because you're exactly right. In the modern university, when I say modern university, the university that had developed after like 1300, right? The modern university is really organized around literacy. It's about reading and it's about writing. The way you get a PhD is you write a dissertation, right? And in order to write a dissertation, you read a lot of other people's stuff that you then codify in your business and you rework it and do all that sort of stuff. And so the way we test students is by reading and writing. And literacy has become the sort of organizing principle, no matter what your discipline. It doesn't matter if you are in history, sociology, or engineering. Writing is crucial to what it is that we do in the academy. But we should also historicize this. Books weren't always important to the university. In the medieval university, books were actually forbidden. So you're asking yourself, how could that be possible? Why would the university forbid books? Because the person at the front of the class giving the lecture didn't want the students to challenge what they said. And if they had books that democratized the power and put it in the hands of the students against the professor, so the professors would say, leave the books in the hall. No books in my classroom. So we did what we do in universities prior to literacy, but in different ways. So for example, when you look at what Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages did with the Summa Theologica, that was a oral delivery. That was something that they did as a performance and not as a written. It was written much later, right, and became available to us. What might be happening now is that the challenges that we're feeling on the university and on our normal way of evaluating student learning and thought process is challenging not the university per se, but the university's reliance on literacy. And that we have to maybe rethink what writing and reading are at this period of time. Because you know this, if you give your students a prompt and go home and say, bring back an essay tomorrow, what are you getting? You're getting all this AI-generated stuff. Right? You can't, homework is over. You can't do homework anymore. It just doesn't work. So we have to rethink what we do in the classroom. I'll give you some examples just from my own experience. So even before large language models, I discovered my students were not reading. They're lazy. They got lives, things. If I say to them, go read this dialogue of Plato, come back tomorrow and we'll talk about it, and I got 30 people in the classroom, guess how many people read anything in the dialogue?
5.
2, 5 maybe, right? You can't learn in that situation because you're not sharing the same document that you want to teach from. So what I've been doing is reading out loud in class to my class. We are actually reading together, and we're doing it out loud because then I'm sure they're reading the stuff. We can't read as much. It's a slower process, and it's hard to do with 200 students, where you have to have smaller classes, so you can't do large lectures. Another way that you've got to think about this is we got to think about literacy not as a one-size-fits-all, but as being useful for some circumstances and less useful in other circumstances. In some cases, we ask our students to write because we want the product. We want them to write something. We want them to write a journal article. We want them to write a dissertation. And in that case, it's the product that matters. In other cases, I ask my students to write not because I want the product, but I want to use the result as a way of testing their learning and their achievement. In fact, when I give my students an essay on an exam, I don't care about the product. I throw them away at the end of the semester. I don't cherish them, I'm sorry to say. Right? They're an instrument or a medium through which I try to access the thought process in the student writing the paper. So how can I do that now with large language models? I can't, because if I ask them to go home and write this thing, I'm going to get slop from the AI. So either I have to have them write it in front of me in class on a piece of paper where I can actually see them writing, or I actually have to have them perform it and say it out loud, like Thomas Aquinas. So in a way, all bets are off. We have to really rethink what we do in higher ed with regards to evaluation of students and the role that literacy plays in that entire process. And the problem is that we've been doing this for a good 500 to 800 years, and therefore it seems very comfortable. And we have to begin to get uncomfortable and rethink how we do that. Yeah?
So I wanted to ask about this topic about writing and the aims of education. So there is a recent paper published, I think, in Teaching Philosophy, advocating for this new form of assessment, which is to have students have a philosophical dialogue with their LLM. And I thought that was an interesting proposal. I'm not going to repeat their arguments, but one thing I was thinking about is so the main idea was in philosophy courses we want students to enhance these skills, and these skills could be enhanced or assessed through this form of assessment, and we don't have to do the traditional essays, and also, as you said, most students are using AI to write them anyways. But then I wonder if it's enough if the higher education shifts its focus to just training this form of abilities to have these kind of dialogues, even if there's critical thinking behind it. Do you think there's any value in writing succinct pieces, like long pieces, and put this kind of effort, putting your thoughts into this kind of monologue and like a dissertation?
Yeah.
For maybe for researchers, we're not going to change the landscape of research very soon. But for regular people, is there any value in that sort of skills, and how, just in general, my question is how are the aims of education are changing because of AI?
No, it's a really good question. And I have to answer it yes and no. And here's why. As someone who writes books, I want to say yes. That there is value to long-form experiences, whether it's as the writer or as the reader. Because I think something happens in that process. I think just reading little chunks of text on your mobile device isn't the same as sitting down and reading a novel, right? I think there's a different experience to that. And I value that, and I would like to see that continue to be valued. But But I say no insofar as the realist in me says no one's doing that. Like I used to write really thick books. If you look at the machine question, it's a really thick book. If you look at the most recent communicative AI book, it's half the size. And it's half the size because I know that the really thick book, if I give it to my students, no one's reading it. And shorter pieces, shorter books, shorter chapters, shorter condensed kinds of things seem to resonate with the current generation of students. So I'm fighting myself on this. I mean, I want to retain the long form as somehow important to what it is we do, but I also want to be realistic about what it means to write in the 21st century at this period of time. And to go to your example of this dialogue with LLMs, I've done this, and it actually is really interesting for two reasons. One is, we don't want to prohibit students from using this technology. Prohibition teaches nothing. They are going to graduate, go into a world where these things exist. And you know, prohibition always leads to people using it anyways. It never, solves the problem, right? So we have to model for them the right use. We have to show them what using a large language model means, and what is an ethical use of it, what is a responsible use of it, how should we employ these things in higher ed. And it's our job not only to tell them, but show them. And I think one way you show them is this dialogue exercise, because it not only engages them in using the technology, but they begin to learn how to use it in this iterative mode, where it becomes a writing partner and not just like a crutch that does the work for them. So they are working with the algorithm back and forth in creating this dialogue. What you can do to take that one step further is after the dialogue is done, you have them share their dialogues with each other. And then you have a more wide-ranging conversation about what happened in the dialogues, and maybe even criticizing each other's approach to this and trying to help them further develop their skill set in kind of a peer review process. And that seems to work pretty well too. But again, we're very early on here. Remember, ChatGPT is released in 2022. That's not long ago. And it's going to take a decade or 2 decades for us to figure out what these new models are and what these new modes of both delivery of content and modes of evaluation are. But I think the important thing, and the good news here, is it's time to be inventive. It's time to experiment. It's time to try stuff. And yeah, you'll try something, it'll fail miserably. But unless you try it, you don't know. And students really appreciate the fact that you're trying. I've had a few experiments go really bad in using large language models with my students. But then we focus on why it went bad and talk about what can be learned from that, and that becomes a learning opportunity. And so what they don't want us to do is to pretend like it's not there. They want us to engage it, they want us to engage them with it, and the more honest we are about that, the better. Yeah?
Thanks for the lecture first. I'm wondering that if, as you said, that logocentrism writing is dying because of generative AI today, what should we consider like valuable writing in the future? Because from my view, that logocentrism has not only influenced our way of understanding what writing is, but it also influenced our way of understanding what kinds of writing is like beautiful or valuable or worth reading.
Yeah.
It's like maybe we would think like a good text is something that reveals your thoughts, or like poetry is spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Then if the preliminary has deprecated, then maybe we should address some new way of thinking what is valuable writing is, and how we should produce it. Right?
No, this is really important. One of the best lines in the Bart essay, Death of the Author, is he says, the death of the author means the birth of the reader. He flips it around. And his point is that when you start to get rid of this notion of the all-powerful authoritative author, then reading becomes much more open, much more flexible, much more dynamic. And that means you can read in all kinds of different ways. You don't have to read to say, what was the author trying to say to me in the text? You can read the text to say what sort of conflicts are in the text itself. What sort of opportunities are available in the materiality of the text that allow me to say something different with it. I think this goes back again to what DJs were doing with sampling. DJs were saying, well, I don't want to listen to the whole song. I want that drum beat. And they just grab that drum beat. And I want that guitar part. And they just grab that guitar part, and then put them together and get something different. I think we can read that way. I think we can read in a more hypertextual way, moving from one thing, following a lead to another thing, and jumping around, because why not? I think we can read a text backwards. I've done this before. There are some texts that make Hegel's logic makes more sense backwards than forwards. And I say this as a Hegel scholar. Because the methodology of the logic is in the final chapter.
Yes.
So if you read the end of the book before you read the beginning of the book, and you read from the backwards or from each end into the middle, you get a much better understanding of what Hegel's all about. And so we've got to learn different ways of reading. We've got to experiment with different ways of reading. And I think if we look at our history, we can see already in the 1920s, the Dadaists and the Surrealists were taking books and cutting them apart and rearranging them and then reading them that way. It sounds like violence. Yeah, it is, but it's a really cool, interesting violence. Or take a book, remove a chapter, and try to read it without that chapter. Like, this is some of the experiments that were done, in that period of time. And it's because they were obsessed with the materiality of the text. What could a reader do with the text without the author pulling the strings behind the scene? Now, granted, there are certain times where you want to read a text to find out the vulnerabilities of that particular poet and their experiences, and they express it very well in their poetry. But that's only one mode of reading. That shouldn't be the mode of reading. And we've got to figure out what these other modes are and see what they deliver for us. And again, it's a kind of experimentation. And it's an availability of a kind of almost democratizing of text in the hands of the reader.
Anyways, let's get back to the writing issue. So I tried to argue on behalf of the logocentrist side to try. Well, so it seems that there's your core thesis is that the logocentrist conception of writing is over because we have now writing without authorship, such as generative AI.
Right.
So what if a logocentrist rebuts as follows? The AI is not really writing, precisely because it's lacking focus.
Yeah.
So that's actually well manifested in our practice of teaching.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't want students to use AI deferentially.
Right.
Because they're not thinking. So we say, because you're not thinking, you're not really writing. And that's actually evidence of the logocentrist conception of writing being alive rather than dead, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. So this idea that they can't be writing because they don't have an intention to say something. That is the logocentric definition of writing. There's other definitions of writing that don't fit that model. And so it's a matter of what model of writing you are operationalizing. And both Derrida and many other 20th century literary critics have other notions of writing that aren't beholden to this representation of speech. And this idea that speech is primary and that writing is secondary, and it just represents what you would have said were you able to do so, that comes out of Plato. I mean, that already is in Plato and in Aristotle. And the big challenge that Derrida has to this is that's why philosophy doesn't like writing, because it's secondary. And when it's secondary, it's out of control, and it doesn't say things directly, it says things indirectly. And this idea of getting back to the original spoken dialogue in the Platonic form is the sort of main idea that is involved in that. So I think it depends on how we define writing. And you can define it in the logocentric tradition, or you can modify the definition to challenge that way of thinking about writing as secondary.
Right, just one quick follow-up. I'm very glad that you raised the issue of having many conceptions of writing. So it touches upon the classical philosophical methodological question. So are we doing descriptive metaphysics or revolutionary metaphysics? It's precisely that. So is your proposal that we are actually using a logocentrist conception of writing? Or are you saying that we're actually using a non-logocentrist conception of writing already? Or are you proposing a new conception according to which logocentrism is advocated?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So, to answer the first point you had, is this traditional metaphysics or is it revolutionary? It's neither. And it's neither because of this. You have this standard hierarchy, or the standard binary opposition, speech, writing. Speech is number one, writing is number two, right? So in any hierarchy, and this is a point Derrida makes, it's never equal. The two terms are never on equal footing. One always has priority. Speech has the priority in logocentrism, writing is always secondary. A revolutionary gesture would say, well, make writing primary and speech secondary. But notice, when you turn things around, revolution means turn around, right? When you turn things around, you don't change the relationship. You just change who's in charge. So revolution is not disruptive enough. So the Derridian move is to say we need to deconstruct the binary. And so what Derrida invents is this new term called archaic writing, which is a different kind of writing that is not opposed to speech or writing, but is the origin of speech and writing. And that's the manner by which I take this thing.
Just to add on your point on revolution, authorship, readership, maybe. It seems like the death of authors signified this revolution on the reader's side.
Yeah.
And then what we're facing now with AI and AI-generated content, do you think it's like a revolution on both sides, the author and the reader? Because now I think people in general are also pretty fed up with AI-generated contents, those like with really cliche plots, mechanic languages that they use, repetitive things that they do. What it means like, because so far we focus more on the author side.
Right.
What about on the reader side? What do you think? How could a revolution or evolution be on that side?
Yeah, it's interesting because you'll discover when you ask your students to read a document and it's a PDF that they can download from the internet, what are they doing with that document? They're uploading it to the large language model and asking the large language model to summarize it. And then they read the summary. So not only is AI generating the content, AI is reading the content for us and providing us with an executive summary of what's in the document. And again, if you're expecting your students to be honest, they're not being dishonest, they're just being efficient. They got too much to read, and so they're gonna get summaries. Which is why, exercises like reading this stuff in class together and modeling for them what reading looks like. Because I think we assume they come to university knowing how to read. I don't think they do. I think they have to be shown. Not just told, shown in very physical form, like here I am reading a book before you, and this is how we do this sort of stuff. I think again, it's a very fertile moment in time to think through our assumptions about reading and the expectations we have of reading. Because I don't know that we've ever had the moment to really reflect on that and say, what do we mean when we say reading, and what do we want reading to look like in the era of the large language model? And that means, again, a lot of experimentation. But I told my students, one way to use the large language model is when you have a big thing to read, if you want to get a summary, why not? Get the summary, read it. It's a kind of abstract, right? And then we're going to work together to read through the document. And use your experience with the summary as a kind of entry point into the longer experience. But we're the ones that have to cultivate that kind of procedure. We're the ones that have to create the opportunity for it and to guide them in that process, because they're not going to do this themselves.
Right. And just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think so it's also about what the readers have to do, and Because I think one thing that one consequence of this generative AI text is that I think it creates a greater burden on the reader to identify what is trustworthy
Yes.
and not trustworthy.
Correct.
Right. Because before those technology, there's a clear correlation between the trustworthiness of the content and the form of the text. So like if a text that looks like really logical and reasonable, usually the content is also trustworthy.
Right.
But now I think that with those large language models, we don't have that correlation anymore.
Correct.
Right. So therefore, it will be harder for the readers to identify which text is more trustworthy. Right. And also so this is also related to the discussion in like social epistemology, where they talk about testimonies. Right? This is that we rely on other people's testimonies to acquire knowledge, and traditionally we look at for example the experts' credentials. We look at so their whether they have been their background, and to see where and to figure out like what they say, whether the things that they say are trustworthy or not. But now with AI, and we can really figure out like the AI's credentials or like background. So that doesn't exist. So I think that creates a lot of problems on like our acquisition of knowledge in this new age. Right?
No, this is really important. So the problem of trust isn't that there's large language model generated content we can't trust. The problem of trust right now is that we don't know what is large language model generated and what isn't. We don't know where trust is anymore. We're in a situation of immense uncertainty, because when you are confronted with a text, there's no way to know for sure its provenance, where it comes from. And the author served a very useful function in epistemology, because certain names, like Chomsky, like Plato, like Aristotle, became brand names. And if that name was attached to a text, you could be pretty confident it's worth reading. And that became a heuristic for judging the trustworthiness of various kinds of things. Not only authors' names, but publishers' names. If you get a book from a university press, usually you assume it must be a credible, trustworthy document because it's from a reputable publisher, right? So we have all these sort of heuristics that we've developed in the era of literacy to be able to trust various written documents. And now all bets are off, because every journal in the field of any academic discipline is inundated with text where the reviewers don't know, is it human generated or is it AI generated? And they review them, and sometimes we publish AI generated content, but it's never revealed that it's AI generated content. And as a result, the entire apparatus of using these heuristics of saying this is a reputable journal, it must be trustworthy, and then you find out it's AI generated stuff in publication. So how do we resolve this? The difficulty is that all these certificates and all the assurances that we can give are all untrustworthy. If you, as a writer, on your text say this is 100% organically human created, you can say that, but also an LLM can do that. You can forge it. You can use forgery. Your signature, let's say you sign your document and you say, I wrote this and here's the author's signature. The signature can also be forged and simulated. Watermarks can also be faked, right? So all the things that you would want to be looking for as a certificate of authenticity doesn't really anchor these things in trust and in the ability for you to trust the content. It's also creating problems for human writers, because some human writers, me included, have had our stuff flagged as AI generated. Why? I like the M dash. I have written with the M dash my entire life, and now AI-generated text uses the M dash. And as soon as someone sees the M dash in something I've written, they're like, it must be AI-generated. And so now human authors are trying to prove that they're human authors by writing against what the large language model tends to do, and changing their writing style so that it seems more human, right? So this becomes this chasing of a tail where no one's going to catch up. And I will just say, we will have to figure this out. But right now, we don't know. We have this immense uncertainty before us. But we've been here before. When the printing press was brand new, we were unable to determine the authenticity of any document printed by Gutenberg or anybody else with a printing press. Over time, we figured out ways of authenticating and certifying published content as trustworthy or not. But it took hundreds of years. Is it going to take 100 years here? Probably not. Things are moving pretty quick, but we're going to have to figure this out. And we're going to have to figure out ways of authenticating. So just to give you some ideas. Some people have been talking about using blockchain as an authenticating way of marking human-generated content. You see various schemes like that. But this again is going to be a lot of experimentation as we try to figure this out. Yeah.
I do have another question. Going back to this logocentrism paradigm, in a way, I guess I agree with you that there's a paradigm shift a little bit, but a lot of the mentalistic interpretations of language, I'm not sure whether they're fully there in the LLMs anymore, but they're certainly somehow there in the training data.
Yeah.
So,
right.
So in the training data, you'll probably be able to read a lot of stuff that only makes sense if you catch the implicature. If you catch what the guy who wrote the stuff, whatever the LLM was trained on, was trying to say, and that kind of language that's sort of very much dependent on mentalistic interpretations,
right,
went into the LLM. And similarly for sort of world guided interpretations of language, the training data is, of course, the training data was written with language in this very normal way that, the guy who wrote it was in contact with the objects in the world, and so they wrote the text, so there's a clear sort of causal path from what's in the training data to the objects that are represented by that piece of language. So I kind of agree with you that, of course, the LLM doesn't really want to say something, or maybe some people would claim that they do, but you might as well assume that they don't. But a lot of the language that's used is sort of, in some sense, I don't know how, but sort of parasitic on mentalistic interpretations of language. And I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So the training data comes from us. The large language model is trained on every piece of text that we've generated that has ever been digitized. So the entire internet, all of the books that are in digital form, every email you ever wrote, everything on Reddit, everything on every social media platform, that's the training data. And so this idea that there must be some sort of residual mental capacity there in the training data, I think that's a reasonable way to think about it. But we have to recognize that the large language model is only putting words in order of statistical probability. So what it's learning is not the mental content, it's learning the material of the statistical pattern. And that statistical pattern is what it does in its generating of content. Now, does that contain something that somebody somewhere wrote? It contains not the content that maybe you wrote in an email message, but it contains the statistical probability of your email message with every other single human being's email message on planet Earth and the way that we arrange words in order. So what the large language model is really concerned with, if we can say it's concerned with anything, is the surface of language. It only cares about the order of words. And some word orders are more probable than others. And that means that it is only giving us what we expect to see given these probabilities. And where the mental part happens is on the side of reception, when we read it. And then we connect the dots. And that means that this idea of Bart flipping the script on how this happens is that it's not the writer who intends to say something, it's the reader who discovers something that they then say must have been what the author was saying. This reading interpretation effect. So it's that kind of thing that is involved here. And I think this for us is really brand new because we don't usually think of language as probability. We think of language as saying something. I have an idea, I want to say it, I use language to say it. But from the model's perspective, that is absolutely not even in play. The model just knows that to be or not to be is just a sequence of words. And it means nothing.
Great.
If there's time,
Yeah.
I can ask.
Yeah,
a
there's time.
question. So just maybe following up on the mechanisms of large language models. So I don't know if you are familiar with this type of work that can be thought of as like conceptual engineering projects of concepts such as like responding or arguing. So the idea is that the definition of these concepts, how we use them, have evolved, and then it is if a lot of people find it natural to say that ChatGPT argues blah blah blah.
Right.
Then we should. That's how we should use this concept. So I don't know what you think about this kind of work.
No, so we have to use, we can't describe these things without using the language we have. Like there's no other way to talk about these technologies without using what has been fabricated for us in our history of using language. And so when we say ChatGPT understands, it's a kind of anthropomorphism, yes, but it's also just because that's the word we have. We don't have other words to talk about this. And so we're constantly struggling against our own language in trying to be more precise about what the model is actually doing. So you hear people say, ChatGPT understands this, but not really understanding. It's right, these clarifications constantly trying to use language to correct language. And that's because we also are beholden to the languages that we learn to speak and that we utilize to describe the world around us. And as a result, we can't expect for us to just start using brand new terminology to talk about these things. And inevitably, we are going to attribute to them human traits, human expectations, emotions, understanding, concepts, and all this stuff. And the real challenge is how are we able to recognize what is different in the model from us when we're using our language to describe how it functions. And that, I think, is the real struggle right now. I don't think anthropomorphism is wrong. There are some engineers who will say, well, just don't anthropomorphize. And my answer to that is, well, then stop talking. Because we anthropomorphize everything. We anthropomorphize our pets, we anthropomorphize each other, we anthropomorphize our automobiles. It's the way that we make sense of our social world. And it's by projecting our expectations onto others. Because we don't know the mind of the other, whether it has a mind or not. It's the other mind's problem, so we are always projecting and guessing based on our own experience. That's how we make sense of things. We're going to do it to the large language model too. But what we do need to understand and what we do need to learn how to do is we need to learn how to manage that anthropomorphism in a way that helps us really make sense of the challenges and the opportunities of these technologies and doesn't lead us into believing something that is not really there. Yeah.
Just one question. I would like to ask actually whether Professor Yu would say that AI is signaling that the author is something alarming for human beings. And I ask this question because I wonder what might be the most important implication you think of this whole scenario. Would you say that it's signaling that the author means we human beings need to somehow strengthen, grasp firmer on the notion of authority and make sure whatever AI produces should be more accountable or traceable? Or
Right.
would you say that it would lead us to a new landscape of content production, distribution, comprehension that is so revolutionized that we perhaps need not to care about authority anymore, or authorship anymore?
I like the second one. But I do recognize that in practical reality, we have to solve questions about accountability, responsibility, because that has very legal and practical outcomes. But I do think that, and this really comes from what I was talking about before with remix and hip hop, I think there's ways in which these innovations are asking us to reconsider what we think creativity is, what we think authority is, what we think authorship is. And that means that it is creating new opportunities for different ways of creating content, different ways of empowering other players to play a role in developing content, which maybe they wouldn't have the ability to do previous to that. So I think the second thing that you mentioned is really crucial, because I like the way in which this is really disrupting hundreds of years of authority and allowing for a redistribution of the opportunities.
And what would you say that have grounded this very manner of human beings like to ask for the responsibility or accountability of the content use?
So inevitably, we're going to have to, in some cases, assign someone or something to be responsible.
For whatever questions or we as readers may have, or for I don't know, more like legal requirements, stuff like that.
Right, no, and I think there can be differences there, right? I mean, just because the law needs to have someone to attach copyright to, doesn't mean as a reader you have to attach the authority to the same locus. There can be different ways of distributing these things. And I think you see that when you just look at how we talk about a film. We don't talk about a film in terms of who owns the copyright. We don't say it's a great Warner Brothers film. We say it's a really great Tarantino film. Right? And that's because of the way that we see the film. Or we look, you know, it's a Meryl Streep film. We look at the actor, right? And attach the film to the actor. So there's ways that we make sense of this stuff in our practice that is different from the way that maybe a court or a legislator would make sense of these things. But I think we have to recognize those differences aren't accidental. I think those differences tell us something about the role these different objects and experiences play in our social reality.
Well, if there's no further questions, I think this was a nice and rich discussion and presentation. So let's thank David.
Thank you.